Hello, welcome to BibleDudes. This lecture is about Jeremiah, one of the major prophets in the Hebrew Bible. In Hebrew, his name is Yirmiyahu. The Yahu part is clearly in reference to Yahweh, but there's some debate about the Yirmi part at the beginning. It comes from one of two roots, with the first being Resh Mem He, which means to cast or shoot, as in to shoot an arrow. The root can also mean to deal treacherously with, but most scholars believe here the word has something to do with to loosen or to make slack. Some think the name means Yahweh has loosened, with a mother's womb being the thing that loosened and thus gave birth to a child. But probably more likely, in my opinion, is that it comes from the root Resh Vav Mem, which means lofty or exalted. So the name means something like Yahweh is exalted. Here is a marble statue by Donatello. And the subject here is Jeremiah, and he looks pretty depressed. And I don't blame him. I guess the most difficult thing in my life was witnessing the flooding of New Orleans when those levee walls and all the drainage canals collapsed. And I know it's not wise to compare tragedies, but I have to say that I wouldn't trade lives with Jeremiah for anything. He lived through a very tumultuous period during which the dominant power in the ancient Near East, Assyria, fell to the Babylonians. And then the worst part was that Jeremiah knew that it was pointless for his country Judah to stand up against the mighty Babylonian Empire. But no matter what Jeremiah said or did, the people didn't listen to his warnings, and Jerusalem was violently captured. This meant murders, torture, rape, exile, enslavement, and many horrible things for an entire generation. If you want to read more about how awful those days were when Jerusalem fell, I'd suggest you read the book of Lamentations in the Hebrew Bible. It talks all about these things, plus it says food was so scarce that mothers ate their own children, and that's pretty awful. So Jeremiah is traditionally said to be the author of Lamentations, but no Bible scholar that I know believes that. Instead, Lamentations were amazing poems written by more than one author, probably written in Palestine shortly after the events they describe. But back to Jeremiah. So here we have Michelangelo's painting on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Obviously, Jeremiah didn't look like this. This is what an Italian Renaissance man might have looked like. Some art critics have said it's also a self-portrait of Michelangelo himself. He's here lamenting over the destruction of Jerusalem. Again, though, the artist captures just how depressed Jeremiah is described to be. And there's one last painting of Jeremiah I want to take a look at. And this is Rembrandt's painting of Jeremiah, painted in the 17th century. Jeremiah seems to have taken some of the gold and silver cultic vessels out of the temple, and you see the temple's burning in the background. Someone after Rembrandt wrote the letters Bibel for Bible on the book later. And here we see a close-up of Jeremiah's face. Jeremiah is upset that he predicted this event, the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, but he was powerless to stop it. He's very much like the Greek prophetess Cassandra, who could see the tragic future but could not stop it happening. So, here we see the word Bible written a little bit more clearly on the book. And if we look inside this square, I'm going to show you what's going on just in front of the temple. So here's a close-up of that area inside the square, and we see a man wearing fancy clothes grasping his eyes. I don't know if you can see it. It's this guy right here who's facing off to your left. This is meant to be King Zedekiah. Zedekiah was the last king of Judah, the last descendant of David to sit on the throne after a dynasty of close to 500 years. Zedekiah didn't listen to Jeremiah. He rebelled against Babylon. After a siege, Zedekiah tried to escape with his children, but they were caught. And to show you how hardcore the Babylonians were, they killed Zedekiah's sons in front of him, and then poked out his eyes, so that the last thing he saw was his children being killed. The Babylonians, like all ancient empires, did ruthless things like this to send a message so that other kings wouldn't rebel, and they could collect their taxes. So you see, it's all about the money. You make an example out of one group of people, and the other people are more likely to pay you. All right, so if we look at the historical background with Jeremiah, I want to point out a few key events. In 621 BCE, we get the religious reforms of Josiah, where the king said to have somebody find a document in the temple that says they should reform their religion. The main points for us, I guess, are that it says you can only worship the deity Yahweh, and you can only worship him in Jerusalem. Then in 612, the capital city of Assyria, Nineveh, falls. So Nineveh's falling, or Assyria's falling apart. It's going to end officially, I guess, with the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BCE, where the Babylonians take over the Assyrians. And part of these battles between Assyria and Babylon, in 609, King Josiah dies when he gets shot in the Jezreel Valley at Megiddo by Pharaoh Necho II from Egypt. Egypt's en route to help their enemy, Assyria, against the new enemy, Babylon. It's not clear why Josiah is writing out there. Is he working with the Babylonians trying to stop Necho? We just don't know. Then we get 4 more rulers in a pretty quick amount of time. Jehoahaz rules 3 months, and he's taken away prisoner to Egypt. Jehoiakim is put on the throne. Then when he dies, Jehoiakim rules for 3 months, and he's taken away to Babylon. And then Zedekiah is going to be the last king of Judah. And he's the guy, remember, who rebels and gets his eyes poked out. The Babylonians appoint a governor named Gedaliah, who's going to be in charge of the area of Judah. But he's assassinated after ruling for 3 months. We'll see this story in a little bit. So here's a family tree of these Davidic kings ruling Judah. You get Hezekiah and his religious reforms, and then Manasseh, and almost 50 years of relative peace and prosperity in the first half of the 7th century BCE. Then Ammon, then Josiah, and here's Josiah's descendants who rule, quite a few of them. Remember, after Josiah, we get Jehoahaz, and then we get Jehoiakim with an M, then Jehoiakim with an N, and the last king is Zedekiah. All right, let's look at the superscription of Jeremiah. The words of Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, of the priests who were in Anathoth in the lands of Benjamin, to whom the word of Yahweh came in the days of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah, in the 13th year of his reign. It came also in the days of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, and until the end of the 11th year of Zedekiah, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, until the captivity of Jerusalem in the 5th month. All right, so that's a pretty long superscription, but also note that Jeremiah has the longest prophetic prophetic career of any prophet, spanning 47 years, if you add up all those numbers. I also want to point out this city, Anathoth. It's an important city for the understanding Jeremiah. If we look at a map, the arrow on the left is the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, with the Dome of the Rock located inside of it. That's where Solomon's temple stood at the time of Jeremiah. And the arrow to the right is the village of Anathoth. So it's not very far from Jerusalem. This was a real center for Mushite priests. And I should give you a little bit of background with that. When I say Mushite priests, it means Moses priests. So we have to go back to the time of King David. When he was a ruler and he took over Jerusalem to be the capital city, 2 groups wanted to be high priests. One was descended from Moses, and the other descended from Moses' brother Aaron. So you have Moses priests and Aaron priests. David was politically brilliant, and he appointed 2 high priests, one Aaronid and one Mushite. Well, David got old, and his sons Adonijah and Solomon fought to be king, and the priests had to choose. The Aaron priests went with Solomon, the Moses priests went with Adonijah. Solomon won, and he banished the Moses priests. Where to? You guessed it, he banished them to Anathoth. So it's likely that Jeremiah was a Moses priest. He has strong connections to 2 famous biblical sources, with each of which has strong Moses priest connections. One of which is called the Elohist, or the E-source, which is one of the major sources in the Torah, first 5 books of the Bible, as well as the Deuteronomistic historian, who has strong ties to Moses priests. And we'll have a little bit more on that later. So let's continue with Jeremiah's opening chapter. The word of Yahweh came to me, saying, Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. I said, Alas, sovereign Yahweh, I do not know how to speak. I am too young. But Yahweh said to me, Do not say I am too young. You must go to everyone I send you to and say whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you, declares Yahweh. Then Yahweh reached out his hand and touched my mouth and said to me, I have put my words in your mouth. See, today I appoint you over nations and kingdoms, to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. Some key points here. Notice that it says all nations, not just Israel. So Yahweh is evolving. Earlier in the 8th century and the 9th century BCE, Yahweh was the God of Israel, and prophets were prophets of Yahweh, chosen to give the messages to Israel and Judah. But now we're getting close to an idea about absolute monotheism, where Yahweh is the only deity, and prophets are chosen to give international messages, not just to Israel. This is going to evolve even further into complete monotheism during the exilic period. And then the other point I want to make is it says he's consecrated in the womb. Right? Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. So that's interesting. And then Yahweh puts his hands out and touches Jeremiah's mouth to convey that the words are not Jeremiah's, but they're Yahweh's. All right? This is sort of similar to Isaiah with the hot coals on his lips, getting ready to speak these holy words of God. Then in chapter 1, we get two famous visions. It says, the word of Yahweh came to me. What do you see, Jeremiah? I see the branch of an almond tree, I replied. Yahweh said to me, you've seen correctly, for I am watching to see that my word is fulfilled. The word of the Lord came to me again. What do you see? I see a pot that is boiling, I answered. It is tilting toward us from the north. The Lord said to me, from the north disaster will be poured out on all who live on the land. I am about to summon all the peoples of the northern kingdoms, declares the Lord. All right, so with this almond tree, there's some wordplay going on. Shaked is the Hebrew word for almond tree. And then Yahweh says, because you saw shaked, I'm going to shoked, which is the Hebrew word for watch over. All right, so it's wordplay. And a bit more about almond trees. Almond trees are the first tree to bloom in the spring, and it's a brilliant white flower that shows up while everything else is not blooming. Suddenly we get these white flowers from the almond trees. So the idea is connected to it being a watcher, what it has to do with keeping time. So that makes sense. And here's another picture, close-up of the almond flower. So shaked and shoked. And then we get this boiling pot facing north. Some apocalyptic crazy groups have gone wild with this. In fact, every time a northern nation or army invades to its south, people say, aha, the end of the world is here, just like Jeremiah predicted. But Jeremiah was instead just simply talking about people from Mesopotamia, or in his case, the Babylonians. Given the physical geography of the region, Judah can be attacked by invading armies coming from the south, from Africa or Egypt, or perhaps the army can come from the north. So you see this arrow coming down from the north, and it could be the Assyrians or Babylonians in this case. You can't really invade from the east because it's a desert, and the west is the Mediterranean Sea. People didn't sail in the open waters at that time, they hugged the coast. So even if they came from the north, by sea, they would still be hugging the coast. So there's some textual problems with Jeremiah. The text is poorly organized. It's far from chronological. And notice that the Greek translation of the Bible, called the Septuagint, or LXX, here the Roman numeral for 70, so the Septuagint's in different order, and it's an eighth shorter than the Hebrew version in the Masoretic text. Right? Jeremiah shows better than any prophetic book the editorial process, where we get the prophet Jeremiah speaking something, somebody else writing it down, in this case his scribe Baruch ben Neriyahu, and then we get people reading it to various leaders or various people. All right, we see strong ties with Jeremiah and the Deuteronomistic historian. Well, remember back when I said I'd get back to the Deuteronomistic historian? Well, here we are. In the 1940s, a German scholar named Martin Noth noticed that much of the material in the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, which are also called the former prophets, well, Noth noticed that it was compiled by someone sharing the same theological perspective and vocabulary as those responsible for the book of Deuteronomy. Therefore, Martin Noth called this person the Deuteronomistic historian. And to say that again, he believed the Deuteronomistic historian was responsible not just for the book of Deuteronomy, but for large parts of the history of Israel recorded in Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. That goes from the time of Moses' death all the way through the events of 586 BCE, the destruction of Jerusalem, and the beginning of the exile. So Noth believed that DTR, which is the abbreviation for Deuteronomistic historian, He believed that DTR lived during the Babylonian exile, and that's mostly because the last part of the book of 2 Kings refers to the exile and doesn't go further. However, a number of scholars now think that DTR lived before the exile, and that the last noticed in 2 Kings was added later. Many scholars also notice that the theology and vocabulary of DTR matches Jeremiah. So, both Jeremiah and DTR believed that the religious reforms of Josiah were a very good thing, and that God was sending the Babylonians for the sins of the people of Judah. Jeremiah has a scribe that writes down his prophecies. Jeremiah's scribe, his name is Baruch ben Neriyahu. Ben means son of, so it's Baruch the son of Neriyahu. And so some scholars have argued that the best candidate we have for the author of Jeremiah, not just being the author of Jeremiah, but perhaps the same author who wrote Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, and Deuteronomy, as one of the most famous and powerful authors in all of human history, can be identified with this man, Baruch ben Neriyahu. So, in one of the most amazing finds in biblical archaeology, well, first let me show you his name, Baruch ben Neriyahu. But perhaps we can look at Baruch ben Neriyahu's signature today. All right, here we have a seal impression. It's tiny. It's the size of your little fingernail. And it's called a seal impression, or a bola. And if we look at the lines, it's in 3 different registers. The first line says, belonging to Baruch Yahu. So it's Baruch with this Yahweh suffix at the end of his name. The middle register says Ben Neriyahu, or son of Neriyahu. And at the bottom line it says the scribe. So this might be the signature of a very important author in the Bible. And with the editorial process, Jeremiah says the prophecy. Baruch again writes it down. It's read in public, and at times it's read to the king. In one story in Jeremiah, the king has the words of Jeremiah read to him, and then he burns the scroll with the idea that hopefully that won't come true. But then Jeremiah goes back and reads another version of the prophecy, and again Baruch writes it down. But anyway, this is the bulle of Baruch, Jeremiah's scribe. All right, so Jeremiah gets in trouble for claiming that Yahweh sent him to deliver a message for the impending destruction of Jerusalem. And Jeremiah even says the temple where Yahweh lives is going to be destroyed. The people want Jeremiah to die for this, as they see it as both treasonous and blasphemous. But some of the elders remember the words of Micah, the prophet, from a century earlier. It's very rare when we have people in the Bible quoting earlier biblical writings. It's very useful, as you can imagine, for scholars when they attempt to assign dates for various writings. But let's look at this passage in Jeremiah 26. Some of the elders of the land stepped forward and said to the entire assembly of people, Micah of Moreshet prophesied in the days of Hezekiah, king of Judah. He told all the people of Judah, this is what Yahweh Almighty says. Zion, remember that's another name for Jerusalem, Zion will be plowed like a field. Jerusalem will become a heap of rubble, the temple hill a mound overgrown with thickets. Did Hezekiah, king of Judah, or anyone else in Judah put him to death? Did not Hezekiah fear Yahweh and seek his favor? And did not Yahweh relent, so that he did not bring the disaster he pronounced against them? We are about to bring a terrible disaster on ourselves. So, again, Micah predicted that Jerusalem and Mount Zion, the mountain on which the temple stood, they were going to be destroyed. But the people under King Hezekiah repented, and thus they got God to change his mind, and the city wasn't destroyed. So thank you, Micah, for sparing the city. So Jeremiah survives this very dangerous situation by somebody remembering words 100 years earlier from a prophet named Micah. All right, Jeremiah is known as the weeping prophet. He has, as we looked at the statues earlier, remember how depressed he looked. He's got a very long prophetic activity, as we mentioned. The book of Lamentations is said traditionally to be written by him, but no Bible scholar that I know of believes that. And Jeremiah has some pretty horrible things happen to him. For a time, he abandons his prophetic career and his faith. And in an important passage I want to look at, he, in chapter 20, he curses the day he was born. Excuse me, here's what Jeremiah says, and this does not sound like a happy person. Cursed be the day I was born. May the day my mother bore me not be blessed. Cursed be the man who brought my father the news, who made him very glad, saying, a child is born to you, a son. May that man be like the towns the Lord overthrew without pity. May he hear wailing in the morning, a battle cry at noon. For he did not kill me in the womb, with my mother as my grave, her womb enlarged forever. Why did I ever come out of the womb to see trouble and sorrow, and to end my days in shame? So I think back to Moses asking God that if you're going to keep treating me like this, just kill me now if I found favor in your eyes. Here we see Jeremiah saying he would have been better off if he would have died in his mother's womb. So a very depressed person. And let's jump up here. We saw that. All right, so he discovers that the people of Anathoth, his hometown, and his own family were plotting to kill him. So I don't think anybody would be too happy to find out that your family is involved in trying to take your life. Then in chapters 42 and 43, we get one of my favorite stories from the Bible, and it shows clearly just how difficult it was to be a prophet. So remember Gedaliah? He was the governor of Judah who was appointed to watch over after Zedekiah was removed. So the people of Judah are terrified. The last king, Zedekiah, was taken away in chains. Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians. And now they've murdered the governor Gedaliah, whom the Babylonians put in charge. So they know the Babylonians aren't going to be too happy about that. They go to Jeremiah, the people do, and they beg him to ask Yahweh what they should do. Where should they go? Should they run away to Egypt, or should they stay put? Maybe they should go hide in the desert. They say, Jeremiah, look, you're a true prophet. Everything you predicted has come true. So now, tell us, and whether it's favorable or not, we are going to obey Yahweh's word through you, Jeremiah the prophet. And Jeremiah goes off, and 10 days later, the Bible says the word of Yahweh came to him. Notice that it's 10 days. So prophets have to be patient when seeking an answer from God. It oftentimes is not immediate. You don't know when it's going to come. So, Jeremiah gets his answer from Yahweh, and it's clear. The message says, stay put. Moreover, no matter what you do, do this, right? Don't go to Egypt. Do not go to Egypt. So what do you think happens? Do you think the people listen to Jeremiah as they promised that they would? Instead, they say to Jeremiah, you are a liar, and they put him in chains, and then they drag him off to Egypt. So they do exactly what he says not to do. And that's where Jeremiah is going to die. We don't know much about what happened to him when he left Judah in chains. The group that took him settled in the area of Egypt in Tahpanhes. It's a site in the eastern Nile Delta, not too far from the Suez Canal. It's close to the region of Goshen, where the Israelites were located before the Exodus. So they've come full circle, right? Back in Egypt, as they were at the end of Genesis. So that's the weeping prophet. And Jeremiah, like a lot of prophets, does symbolic actions to get his message across. He's going to increase his audience and help deliver his message. So, at Yahweh's command, Jeremiah never gets married. He never mourned or made merry. Jeremiah has a story where God tells him to take his underwear, go bury it up near the Euphrates River, come back sometime later, dig it up, and show everybody that you can't wear that underwear anymore. So that's kind of a bizarre story. It's supposed to symbolize the coming disaster. But anyway, you don't think about these prophets going naked like Isaiah or doing these things with underwear like Jeremiah. He smashes a jug at a dump to symbolize destruction. Jeremiah is placed in stocks for a while. Remember, the government doesn't care for him much. Jeremiah talks a lot about these people who called the Rechabites, and he praises their fidelity. They keep true to their tradition of living in tents. They don't drink alcohol. I guess they're sort of like Amish in American society. And Jeremiah, while Jerusalem is besieged, is going to, we'll get to that in a second. First, he prepares scroll and has someone else read it. There's an order for arrest. Now, he and Baruch go into hiding, but then Jeremiah is going to buy some land in a symbolic action. Jerusalem is besieged by Babylonians, and he's going to buy some land in Anathoth from his cousin. And the point of this story is that there's hope. It's a horrible business deal, but Jeremiah does it to show that the land will once again someday have value. And on a personal note, it reminds me of the brave people and my neighbors who invested in New Orleans immediately after the flood. And I'm sure wherever you live, you'll have some kind of parallel story to that. Shortly after Zedekiah became king, when Jehoiakim was carried away to Babylon with the first wave of exiles, Jeremiah has a vision. he's told to make a wooden yoke and put it on his neck and go to Jerusalem with a message for Zedekiah, as well as the rulers of Judah's neighbors who were visiting, from Edom, Moab, Ammon, Tyre, and Sidon. The message is that they should submit to the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. Right? Don't fight him, he's too big. Submit to Nebuchadnezzar. Jeremiah says they'll be beasts of burden, but they're going to survive. If they don't submit, and they believe they're false prophets who say that Babylon won't destroy them, and if they put up a resistance against Babylon, then Babylon will totally destroy Jerusalem and the other kingdoms, is what Jeremiah says. Then we meet the prophet Hananiah. Hananiah says that Jeremiah is wrong, that God's going to destroy the Babylonian Empire within 2 years, and he's going to bring back Jehoiakim and all the other exiles. Jeremiah hears this positive message, and he says, Amen. That would be great, Hananiah. But he reminds him that many earlier prophets predicted war and tragedy. So Hananiah then goes up to Jeremiah, and this is a funny scene. He takes off the wooden yoke, and he smashes it. Right? Remember, yoke's this wooden implement they put on beasts of burden, like you see in this picture. So Jeremiah's wearing that. Hananiah takes it off Jeremiah, and he smashes it on the ground. And it's in the temple, and everyone's watching. And Jeremiah just got bullied big time. Imagine all the people laughing at him, especially with his wooden yoke smashed. Jeremiah is very upset. He goes home, and God sends him a message that he delivers to Hananiah. God is going to build a yoke of iron that Hananiah won't be able to smash, he says. He also gets personal and says that Hananiah, because he's a false prophet and has persuaded Judah to trust in lies, God says Hananiah will die within the year. The text then says that Hananiah died 2 months later. So you better not mess with Jeremiah. And the story reminds me of other famous showdowns between prophets, like when we saw Amos travel north to Bethel and confront Amaziah. Right, so this cuneiform text, which are dated sometime around 590, 570 BCE, sometime around there, it contains a list of rations of barley and oil issued to the captive princes and artisans, including Joachim, king of the land of Yahud. Let me go back to that. Joachim, king of the land of Yahud. This is in direct reference to Jehoiakim, and some of the other tablets also mention his 5 sons who accompanied him to Babylon. So here again we have something in the archaeological record that gives a little bit of background to this story. Alright, so Jeremiah has some stuff about sour grapes. And he says, The days are coming, declares Yahweh, when I will plant the kingdoms of Israel and Judah with the offspring of people and of animals. Just as I watched over them to uproot and tear down, and to overthrow, destroy, and bring disaster, so I will watch over them to build and to plant, declares Yahweh. In those days people will no longer say, The parents have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. Instead, everyone will die for their own sin. Whoever eats sour grapes, their own teeth will be set on edge. So today, sour grapes is an expression meant to show someone's a sore loser. Like, sour grapes, get over it. But in biblical times, it was a common expression about parents doing something and the kids suffer. It'd be like me eating hot sauce and my children's tongues burning. Jeremiah longs for a day when everyone is held accountable for their own sins and not the sins of others. So why would he write this? Well, he lived during the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE. He saw many innocent people suffer, and he saw many horrible people triumph. Remember, the Deuteronomistic historian blames this destruction of Jerusalem on King Manasseh, someone who died more than 50 years earlier. It'd be like blaming September 11th on former President Harry Truman. That would be ridiculous. But in any case, I can think of many examples in my life where I've suffered because sins of people who lived long ago. One example might be slavery. And while I've never owned slaves, that institution impacts my life on a daily basis. Similarly, in the Bible, they had a harsh punishment called kare. And kare meant that they killed you and all of your relatives. So your grandfather could commit a sin and they would kill you because of that, because you were related to him. So Jeremiah seems to not like that. And he's hoping for a time where all of that is in the past. And he says everyone will die for their own sin. So personally, I believe that I've seen examples where people die regardless of sin, but still, I'm glad Jeremiah is calling for personal accountability. And this idea immediately is followed by a prediction for a new covenant. Remember, a covenant is a legal agreement between two parties. In this context, it's a covenant between the people of Judah and their God Yahweh. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares Yahweh. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. All right, so Jeremiah is thinking this new covenant will take place in Babylon. And instead of writing the law on tablets, God's going to put it in the people's minds and on their hearts. This reminds me of another passage in Jeremiah where it says it's not so great just to circumcise ourselves as part of this covenant, but in the future, God's going to circumcise our hearts. It's not meant literal. It just means that we're going to be internal and not external with these changes. All right, so last thing I want to say is that Martin Luther King Jr., while he was getting his master's at studying under Pritchard at the University of Pennsylvania, wrote a paper called The Significant Contributions of Jeremiah to Religious Thought, and he got a B+. So anyway, some famous people have studied Jeremiah before, and that's Jeremiah the Weeping Prophet. And if you're interested, I'd recommend watching the video on the 6th century BCE prophets, or the exilic prophets as they're called, next. Thanks for your attention. The end.